Hello, and welcome to the to the final office hour for ECN 211 for the Global Freshman Academy here at the ASU. Hello, and welcome to the. You're hearing an echo because my other computer is playing the same video. Anyway, I turned it off. So welcome again, and what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the last piece of new material here for the class, which is part 7.1. Part 7.2 is all review and gives you some practice material and has Jared Gruff, who is one of the assistants who helped develop this course, but he's also teaching high school students here in Arizona macroeconomics. Go through some of the structure of the course one more time before you go to the final. And the reason we have that part in part 7 is because it's hard to learn all the details by heart, so it's worthwhile to kind of reconsider what the structure is, that you can kind of think of it as a code rec. And we're providing you basically with different hooks that you could put your knowledge on, a little structure. So Jared is doing that in 7.2, and there's a lot of review material and also some advice on exam strategy. This is something that I encounter a lot when I teach students, that students actually don't really, some of them, the best students, have really thought about how to strategize before they start an exam, but many other students do not. And so there's a little piece of that in part 7.2 that will help you kind of think about, hey, when I do this, what's my strategy? And I think it's useful to do this. We do it deliberately, don't have it before the midterm, we have it before the final. So there's some additional layer of knowledge you can use and see whether you're going to do, when you take that new approach, whether it's going to help you do better on the exam. Now, the final exam is very similar in structure to the midterm. It covers weeks 4 through 7. And in that sense, you've basically gone through it once before already, but obviously with different material. Well, we're very much looking forward to how you're going to do on the final. It's nice to see that many of you are still very active in the course and doing all the assignments. I hope you're enjoying them. And let me show you what I enjoyed when I prepared this part on trade. So what I'll do today is I won't talk much about part 7.2 anymore. I'll spend the rest of this office hour talking to you about the trade part 7.1 in the course. And the fun thing about that is that it's a topic that's extremely relevant. So it's nice to end this course. I mean, all the other topics are also relevant, but this here in the United States, there's a real reconsideration of what the government should do in terms of trade policy. And so it's worthwhile to go through kind of the economist view of that discussion. In particular, actually last week, the Commerce Department here has proposed to put tariffs on steel imports to the United States. And their argument is that this is important for national security reasons. But that is, we need to have producers of steel in the United States who are able to produce the steel necessary also to supply not only civilian goods and services, but also military goods and services. It's an argument that's also being discussed in the course material in 7.1. 7.1 is a little bit longer section, it's a little bit more wordy, largely because we've taken some of that from a textbook that deals with that material very clearly. You see that textbook referred to earlier on in the course and also at the end, so you'll see what that is. It's an open source textbook, OpenStax. And then we've added some interactivity for you to understand some of the arguments in a more interactive way. So let me go through some of the arguments and what the effects are. As you'll see, as a true economist, I am a very pro-trade person, in the sense that I think trade generally is good. It's true that some people benefit more from trade than other people whose jobs are being competed away and who now have to look for different jobs, maybe even they live in an area where there's very few new jobs being created. But we tend to underestimate the benefits of trade. I mean, think about the stuff you're wearing. Something like this costs. Well, let me not exaggerate how cheap it is, but it's I buy these things maybe you don't like my sense of fashion, but these things cost these days in the US $19 to have a shirt with long sleeves. I'm wearing long sleeves today here, even because it's pretty cold for Arizona standards. And if it would all be produced in the United States, this would be a lot more expensive. So why it's beneficial to have countries specialize in the production of different goods and services is something that is worthwhile understanding. And you can even understand this just on the individual level. And that's what we do in this part 7.1 first. Or one of the things we do is to really think about why we would favor specialization. So that's one thing we'll look at. But we'll start off by a simple accounting identity. So let's start off with the circular flow diagram and really think about what's going on. And let's put that in the context of current policy proposals here in the United States. To do that, I'm going to pull up the circular flow diagram. Give me 1 second so that I can put the screen sharing on here. There you are. Here's the circular flow diagram. And and what you're seeing is what's important here is something very simple, which is that if you look at the financial sector here in the circular flow diagram, remember that all the ingoing arrows need to add up to the outgoing arrows in a circular flow diagram. So the sum of private savings, borrowing from abroad, investment, and government borrowing, the sum of private savings and borrowing from abroad needs to equal government borrowing and investment by the private sector, by the business sector. So what's happening? Let's think about this here in the United States at the moment. It's worthwhile to think through policy proposals here. We've seen a major tax cut in the United States where the forecasts are, unless this tax cut has enormous effects on our GDP, a very big effects, and some people believe that it does. I might be a little bit more on the skeptical side on that discussion. But most forecasts say that the tax cuts that have been proposed will have the government run a substantially bigger budget deficit, and so we have an increase in government borrowing going forward. Now, if we think that we're not going to see a big effect on private savings and investment, then the only way that this government borrowing can be financed is actually through this borrowing from abroad. But in order to borrow from abroad, one of the things you'll learn is that this borrowing from abroad is effectively the same as the trade balance. So the title of this slide says it already, but you'll see this when you go through 7.1.2. And so what's happening here is that if current policies do not have a major effect on the level of private saving and investment, and we're not seeing a big effect, and if anything, we anticipate the tax cuts to actually stimulate investment, then what needs to happen is either more savings from the household sector, or we need to borrow more from abroad. But in order to borrow more from abroad, we actually have to run a bigger trade deficit. And so as a result, in order to implement such a policy, such a tax cut, you almost, unless we're really seeing a big change in the savings rate for households, you almost always have to run a bigger trade deficit. And this is just an accounting identity. This is not anything about where you stand on politics or anything. This is simple national accounting. And now, what seems to be the discussion here is that on one end, the discussion is we have tax cuts and we increase government borrowing. And on the other hand, people seem to dislike the trade deficits that we're running, and they would like to have trade policies such to reduce these trade deficits. Now, if nothing happens on private savings and investment even goes up or stays the same, then this is simply an unfeasible agenda to implement for a simple accounting standard. So follow those discussions. It's interesting. This is why macroeconomics is important in the context of thinking about different policy proposals, because these things simply need to add up. So when you read those discussions about tax cuts and the trade deficits, remember that those are not independent things. They are related. and you can the national savings identity basically means that they are tied to each other, and it's hard to think of them independently. And it's definitely true that there are certain proposals that are simply not feasible from an accounting point of view. So bear that in mind, because those things come up a lot. But let's discuss, let's skip the tax cut and the government borrowing for in the rest of this lecture and the office hour, and focus on trade and borrowing from abroad. So a large part of 712 is actually on, what are the benefits and what are the costs of trade surpluses. So I'll leave you to read that on your own. I hope you enjoyed it. I like it. I like that part a lot. I'm not taking credit for writing all the text myself. We have used open source material that was just outstanding, and so enjoy it. It's very useful. So the next thing that I wanted to do is to discuss with you the benefits of trade. And so let me first just show myself for a moment. So I'm going to give you an insight on why it is important to specialize, and why we think in economics that specialization is so important. Now, trade has to do with specialization between countries, but these insights about specialization and the division of labor in the economy go all the way back to Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, and they really have nothing to do necessarily between countries. This translation of specialization and trade to the concept of specialization to trade is really just a generalization of insights we have more generally. And think about it, a baker is good at baking bread, and then will go and hire an accountant to do the accounting of the finances of their business. The baker could do it themselves, but it's easier for a baker to spend more of his time baking the bread and doing the stuff that they're good at, and then having the accountant do what they're good at. And this is all happening everywhere along in the modern economy. And in fact, Adam Smith, and one of Adam Smith's main insights, besides the one about the invisible hand, is that the bigger the market is and the bigger an economy is, the higher the degree of specialization. Now, he uses a different word for that. He calls it the division of labor. And so one of his other main insights is that the division of labor, think of that as the degree of specialization, is increasing in the size of a market. And so let's think about why we would benefit from specialization. And the way we're going to do this is using an interactive. In particular, this interactive has to do with Adam. You can read the whole storyline in the course material. But Adam has a girlfriend called Janet, who we named after Janet Yellen, who just stepped down as Federal Reserve Chair. And well, she didn't step down; she wasn't reappointed. But Janet here is not good at setting interest rates, but is good at making ice cream and pizza. So, sorry, pies. And so let's look at her and at Adam and see what they decide to do when they each meet each other and decide who's going to cook, who's going to make more ice cream, who's going to make more pie. So let's have a look at that. I'll go over some cases and show you there's a couple of important insights. So let me tell you them before I start, and then we will kind of go through the material and think about it. One is that what is important in specialization is not who is better at something, but who is relatively better. Being better at something is called an absolute advantage. Being relatively better at something is called a comparative advantage. And what matters for specialization is actually not who is absolutely better. You can be better at everything. It's still true that you could be a better baker and a better accountant, but if you're still relatively better at baking, you still want to hire an accountant to do the work on that and have someone who's relatively better at accounting do the accounting work for you. So you'll see that here. It's a very powerful insight. And I hope what you do is, if you watch this video, go and look up this interactive yourself again in the course. I'll tell you where it is and try some stuff out. So let's go to the interactive. You've seen enough of me, and we will do that. Look at it. So this is the main interactive. She'll see it's in 7133. And let me see where I'm doing this correctly here. Good. I'm having a, let me zoom out here for a second. I'm having a little issue. Reset talents, set choice to other key. There we are. So here's Adam. And here is Janet. Here's how good Adam is at making pies. So you see, if you make Adam better at making pies, he can make more pies. This is his production possibility frontier. He's just going to spend time in the kitchen, and he can either make ice cream or pies. If you make him better at making pies, you see that he can just, if he spends all his time making pies, which would be here, where he's making no ice cream, he can just make more pies. And this is the amount of time, amount of ice cream he would make if he spent all his time making ice cream. If you reduce that talent, you see then it goes down. So the outer key choice, which is the square in this diagram, is the choice that Adam would make when, to maximize his utility if he would just be on his own. I'm not going to go through the outer key choice because it's going to take too much time as office hours. So I'd like you to do that yourself. That's done in 7132. And it will explain to you how that maximizes his utility. So I'm going to take that as given. The utility at the outer key choice is normalized to be 100. So anytime we're going to find, if we're going to find that Adam and Janet are going to work together to produce stuff and then share whatever they make, and they're going to both get a utility bigger than 100, then they're both better off working together, and you'll see specializing. So here's let's start at a case where here Adam is worse at making ice cream and Adam is worse at making pies. So this is the world in which Adam has a absolute disadvantage, or Janet has an absolute advantage on both making ice cream, because if she would make ice cream, she may spend all her time making ice cream. She would make more ice cream than Adam would. And at making pies, if she spent points. So what you see is that this little area here, which is Adam's production possibility frontier, is inside, all the way inside Janet's production possibility frontier. So she has an absolute advantage in everything. So does that mean that Janet should do everything? No. What is important here is actually the relative advantage. So who's relatively better at making ice cream and who's relatively better at making pies? Well, Adam is making very few pies, even if he spends all his time making pies, but he makes relatively more ice cream. So what's happening is that the height relative to the width of this thing is higher than if I compare the height here and the width here. Sorry, the height here and the width here. The ratio of the width to the height here is larger than the width to the height here. So Adam is relatively worse at making pies and has a comparative advantage, not an absolute advantage, but comparatively. He's relatively better at making ice cream. And you can already see this because the ice cream talent here is 0.6 and the pie talent here is 0.25. So this is the ratio here is more than 2. The ice cream talent here is 0.8 and the pie talent here is 1. So you could also, if you like the numbers, you could take the ratio of the numbers here. So what now can Adam and Janet do? Well, they can behave like they would do if they wouldn't be meeting each other and sharing their goods and the pies and their ice cream. In that case, they would both just choose to produce their outer key point. And that's where this thing starts off. So when you click set choice to other key, they would behave as if they weren't doing any trade and not specializing. So now let's see whether we can actually improve their outcomes and improve their well-being and utility by having them make a different choice. So let's think about having Adam produce more pies. Remember, he's relatively better at making pies. He's relatively better at making ice cream. Now, what happens is now Adam and Janet are they're ending up with more pies, but with a lot less ice cream because all of a sudden Adam is making less ice cream. So when they share all this stuff, at the end, what's happening is that they're going to end up um, sacrificing a lot of ice cream for the benefit of very few pies. And at the end, once they share all these goods, they're basically going to both be worse off. And the reason for this is quite simple. Adam is really bad at making pies. So if he starts making more pies, then he's sacrificing a lot of ice cream in order to do that. Now let's go the other direction. In this case, Adam is making fewer pies and more ice cream. Now, this is going to be good for Janet because she is going to get more ice cream and only a little less fewer pies. But it's going to be bad for Adam because he's losing relatively a lot of pies. So how do we compensate Adam here for the fact that he's going to make more ice cream, but he's going to sacrifice pies? So we'll have Janet make a few more pies because they're sharing the amount of goods that they're making in deviation from autarky. What's happening now is that look, this is sorry, the red square is the traded goods, the orange circle is the autarky. So the red square is now to the upper right part for Janet. So when they share the deviation from autarky, and for Adam, and both of them are getting more pies and more ice cream. And the reason for this is Janet's focuses on what she's relatively better at, and Adam is focusing on what he's relatively better at. And then when they share, uh, they share this. The additional production they get in deviation from autarky, they're both getting more pies and more ice cream, and they're both better off. You see, both their utility is better off. So this is an important insight because you see, even though Janet is good at better at both pies, making pies and making ice cream, she'd still benefit from specializing in the things she's relatively better at and working with someone, in this case Adam, who is not as good at anything as she is, but she would still benefit in him specializing in what he is relatively good at. So the first thing to realize is there's gains from trade here, even though one person is much better than the other. It's not that the best person should do everything. So that's the first insight. The second insight is that once you trade, what you should do is focus on what you're relatively good at, what you have a comparative advantage in. And this is a remarkably um, um, important insight in economics. Now the other thing we did was what's interesting also about trade is that so this happens all the time. So the comparative advantages is what matters. If you don't have comparative advantage, so we could, for example, make them both equal. Then there's actually very little gains from trade. We said, sorry, I made a click out here, not a typo, but a click out. Let me put this back. So now and Adam and Janet are both just as good at making pies and ice cream. And look what happens in this world is that if you try this out, so move both to those to 55. In the course, there's actually an exercise that does this, but instead of Janet, we just have Adam and Adam, and they trade with each other, but they're the same people. You see, the other important insight about specialization is that you actually benefit from working together with people who have relatively different talents than you have. If they have the same talent, then you don't have a comparative advantage over the other person. And there's actually no gains from trade to be made. You can try this out here. We could have Adam specialize one or the other. You'll see you try this out, but there's no gains from trade to be made when they're the same. So that's the third important insight. So the first important insight was it's not about absolute advantage. Even if someone is worse at everything, you still would like that person to specialize in what they are relatively good at. The second thing is the the direction of specialization is always in where you're relatively good at. And the third is that that the gains from trade are bigger the more different the more kind of variation there is in comparative advantage. So the more different the trading partners are, the bigger the gains from trade. And that's really quite powerful insight. So go through 713. We had a lot of fun preparing this part for you. I hope you have a lot of fun going through it. It's cool to try these things out and to really realize what the implications are. And so I hope you enjoyed that part. It's really quite something to see and to try it out and to see how strange. It's really kind of a strange result, but it's an old result. I mean, this goes all the way back. I mean, Adam Smith had this insight, and then within about 50 years, David Ricardo, who's a very, very famous economist from the 19th century, um, formalized this idea, and he looked specifically at trade, and in particular at trade between Portugal and the United Kingdom during the Industrial Revolution. But it's true just in general. This insight is really powerful. So it's fun to go through. And if there's one main takeaway about trade in this course that you should have, is that trade is the benefits from the gains from trade are really, really powerful in a world where you interact with people who are different from you and who have different relative talents. And so that's the part on why economists actually think that trade's beneficial. The next thing I want to do is think about, okay, so if you think that trade's beneficial, the next thing to ask yourself is then why would there be reasons? What do impediments to trade actually do to an economy? And in the course broadly discusses protectionism, but let me talk about tariffs first. And there might be reasons beyond, so national security might be a reason to impose tariffs. That might well be true. So there might be reasons to impose tariffs and for protectionism that are non-economic reasons. But let me focus on the economics of protectionism here, and discuss that. And let me discuss it in the context of steel tariffs, because I think it's useful to think of this in the context of the current news. So let me share my screen again with you. Hold on for 1 second. I'm going to share, let me zoom in on it a little so that you have a better view of it. I'm going to share an interactive from part 7134. It's interactive part 2. So what is this? So this is a diagram that doesn't mention steel. So let me add steel to it. So this is the price of steel. Think of this as the price per ton of steel produced. And this is the quantity. Now remember that the supply of steel in the United States, but almost in any country in the world, is partly because of the production of domestic producers that here in the US are based in the US. And historically, they have been largely located in or around the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area here in the United States. There are some steel producers in other areas, but that's really kind of the center of steel production in the United States. Though, over the last 30 years, the city of Pittsburgh has really shifted from steel producers to steel production, to doing a lot of medical research and things like that. So Pittsburgh is not as much a steel town anymore as it used to be, but their football team is still called the Steelers for a reason. The Pittsburgh Steelers, because there's so much steel production in Pittsburgh. So some of the supply is because of steel production in the United States, but some of the supply is because of steel being imported from other countries. And most notably, that's from Southeast Asia, China, Taiwan, historically, but I think mostly now from China, as well as Japan, by the way. So the supply curve here is not only domestic suppliers of steel, but also foreign suppliers of steel. So what happens if you impose a tariff? If you impose a tariff, then the foreign suppliers of steel are now going to have to pay money in order to import steel into the US. What that's doing is that for the same quantity imported, they'll have to pay a tariff on top of the price. And that's basically effectively going to raise the price that they charge to uh, consumers here in the US. So a tariff is moving the supply curve upwards or inwards, depending on how you look at it, because it's an upward sloping curve. And when you do this, you already see what happens. You're moving up the supply inwards. Now, what that's going to do is the following. It's going to raise the price in the market. So for the US producers who supply steel in this market, it's going to increase the price of the steel at which they can, the price at which they can sell their steel. And as a result, they're going to get more revenue and get higher prices for what they produce. So that seems to be a good thing for producers of steel in the United States. For the foreign producers, it's not so clear whether the price they get is higher, because that depends on whether the increase in the equilibrium price in the market is bigger than um, the tariff that they get charged. So for the foreign suppliers, that could be a wash. That depends at the end of the day both on the supply and the demand elasticity in the market. But one thing is for sure, when you do that and you impose a tariff, look at what happens to the price that the people who demand steel, the consumers of steel in the United States, pay. They pay a higher price. And so where a tariff on steel is good for the local suppliers of a tariff is generally good for the local suppliers of goods, it's not good for consumers because they pay a higher price. And it could potentially actually um, um, and at the end it will result basically in less being produced, less being demanded, an equilibrium quantity going down, and the equilibrium price going up. So the result of a tariff is that a tariff, to some extent, is like a tax on the actual domestic buyers of imported goods. What does that mean if you think about steel tariff? It means that if you increase the price of steel, then if you increase it, if you have impose a tariff on imported steel and increase the price of steel in the United States, then it gets more expensive to construct buildings with steel frames, to manufacture car bodies in the United States. So what could happen, for example, is that car manufacturers are moving that part of car production abroad, and then they will import those car bodies from abroad into the US and then put the rest of the car together here. So it also causes a shift in global supply chains that we don't often talk about when we talk about tariffs and economics, but that are important for multinational corporations when they decide where to produce what or where they source their parts and production from. So that's happening to a steel tariff. Now, with a steel tariff, tariffs basically raise the equilibrium price, lower the quantity, price paid by the domestic demanders goes up, but domestic consumers goes up. That's not good for them. And the person that's good for is the domestic suppliers of these, which don't form all the supply, but those suppliers are going to get higher revenue per unit that they sell. Now, there's basically another diagram in the course, 7134 interactive part 1, that says that this line of reasoning about tariffs is actually true about almost every form of protectionism that is considered. So protectionism are different measures to reduce trade in an economy, but basically reducing trade means you're reducing the domestic supply of different goods and services, and it's all kind of gives you the same thing. Increased protectionism, the supply curve will shift inwards, the equilibrium price will go up, and the equilibrium quantity will go down in the market. Now, this is for one particular market. You could think of the overall macroeconomic consequences of this, but if we would impose a textile tariff like they have in Europe, then all of a sudden a T-shirt that you buy, and you see this, go shopping for a T-shirt in, say, Germany, and the price is higher than in the United States, even though the T-shirts manufactured in both cases in the same factories in China, simply because of because of the textile tariffs that are on certain types of textiles in the EU, and that are largely done to protect some part of the European textile industry, which is mainly based in Italy. So you could see this if you travel around, you do a little travel. You'll see those differences reflected in prices. Protectionism, can take the form of quotas, where we would just reduce the amount of goods that are allowed to be imported. Can be take different forms, but all of these things, you'll see from the lecture, basically are effectively causing an inward shift of the supply curve. So that's on protectionism. Let me end this office hour by discussing some stuff on exchange rates. Um, Exchange rates are really are kind of a thing to analyze on their own. They're hard to predict how exchange rates move. So I want to give you a little bit on how they're measured and how they're determined in markets. But I also want you to realize that a large part of these markets actually have nothing to do with trade of goods and services. It's actually people who speculatively move money around the world and waiting to see whether they make a different return, let's say in New Zealand dollars versus US dollars. So they think, okay, I might make a different return investing money in New Zealand, so I'm going to exchange my US dollars to New Zealand dollars. That's going to give them that's going to reduce the demand for US dollars, increase the demand for New Zealand dollars, and it's going to cause an appreciation of the New Zealand dollar and a depreciation of the US dollar. These trades, where people move financial flows around in anticipation of differences in interest rates or other rates of return, are often called carry trades. And that's actually the largest volume of foreign exchange transactions in the world. It's remarkable that on a weekly basis, I think the number is we trade about 3 times world GDP in foreign transactions. The Bank for International Settlements collects these statistics. It's enormous. And it's mainly done by about 12 big banks who have foreign exchange desks that trade this foreign exchange. So what's interesting, of course, is that on every foreign exchange transaction, there's a currency on one side and the other side. Now, what you should learn is that even many transactions where people trade from the New Zealand dollar into euros, they often go New Zealand dollar, American dollar, euros. This is how this market works. It's quite remarkable. Now, these are largely automated trades, so they go very fast and through computer systems. Let me tell you a little bit about exchange rates in that sense. And there's a couple of confusing things that I think you should kind of be aware of in terminology, and then you can go through the rest of that section on your own. The section is pretty long, I know that. But I hope that you benefit from the examples. And since 7.1 is the only new part in this week in terms of course material, we decided to make it cover a lot of stuff on international economics, so you have some sense about what international economics, trade, and globalization, the economics of trade, globalization, and international financial flows is about. Okay, back to screen sharing. So an exchange rate is really the price of one currency in terms of another currency. So these are euros, these are yuan, these are British pounds, and these are Canadian dollars. And so I put a little US dollar tag underneath it to signify that, for here in the US, you can ask yourself, how many euros do I need to pay to get a US dollar? Or I can ask the reverse, how many dollars do I need to pay to get a euro? Because these transactions go both ways. And this all makes the analysis of exchange rates always a little confusing, because are we measuring the number of euros I pay per dollar or the number of dollars I pay per euro? So that's always a little bit confusing. But talk through it and you'll get the hang of it. The large part is just don't learn it by heart, but try to reason through it, because the logic is going to give you the right result. If you try to learn this by heart, you're going to get confused pretty quickly. So that's kind of the question of exchange rates. So let's look at this international market of exchange rates. So I already told you this market is really big. And then what you basically see is that on the trades, this is the fraction. If we look at foreign exchange rates, what fraction of foreign transactions is done in which currency? And what you're basically seeing is that the US dollar is almost involved in every, this, you see, these bars add up to 200%. And the reason for this is every transaction in foreign exchange markets has a currency on both sides. So that's why these things add up to 200% and 100%. And, you know, for the US dollar, it makes up about 90 out of those 200%, which means almost every transaction in foreign exchange markets involves a dollar at one end or the other end, a US dollar, that is. There's also Australian dollars, Canadian dollars, and other dollars. The other currencies that often get traded in is euros, Japanese yen, the British pound, and then Australian Canadian dollar, the Swiss franc. And the Swiss franc is because some of those banks that do all these foreign exchange trades are actually Swiss banks. And there's a lot of money flows going in and out of Switzerland. Then Chinese yuan, actually, given that China is important for world trade, this is remarkably small flows in terms of yuan. Now, there's capital constraints and other issues with exchanging money into yuan, but it's not very common. And then surprisingly, the Swedish krona is actually another currency that's being used very often. And then so clearly there's more than 150 currencies in the world, so there's many other currencies as well. But they together make up a very small part. The rest makes up a very small part of these foreign exchange transactions. So it's still a very US dollar centric world, and that's why the US dollar is often called the reserve currency, because people hold US treasuries, dollar denominated assets, and dollars themselves as a store of value, effectively, even at an international level. Okay, that's on the percentage of the exchanges. The final thing I wanted to say, and let me end with this, is to think about the market of exchange rates. And here what's really interesting is that we're not really thinking about the demand and the supply of one currency, but the demand here is, think of this as this is the market for the Mexican pesos and the dollar. And so let's denote the exchange rate as the number of pesos I have to pay per US dollar. And then I can ask, and this reflects the trades where people exchange dollars for pesos or pesos for dollars. And so, the demand curve are those people who, and you see that I hesitate again, and I looked at this yesterday in preparation, and now I'm getting a little confused myself. So this is how confusing it is. The demand curve is people who want to exchange pesos to dollars. So if you have to pay more pesos per dollar, then exchanging a peso to dollar are people. Why would there be fewer people who want to exchange? So if you have to pay more pesos to get a dollar, then you're getting fewer dollars per peso that you're exchanging, and so fewer people would be willing to exchange pesos to go to dollars because the dollar is getting more expensive. And so that's why this is the demand curve. Now, at any point, there's some people at any exchange rate. There's some people who want to exchange pesos to dollars because they are people who want to, say, import stuff from the United States to Mexico, and so they need to take their Mexican currency, exchange it to dollars, and then buy stuff in the United States with those dollars. Dollars to pesos is the other way around, and so that's the supply curve here. And then the exchange rate is the price of pesos per dollars. It's this intersection between the flows of people who want to, or the demand, the degree to which people want to exchange dollars to pesos, and the degree to which people want to exchange pesos to dollars. And so here we've written the exchange rate as pesos per dollars, but you could flip this whole figure around do dollars per peso, you could see then you would flip the demand and the supply curve around as well. And that's a little confusing. What is important is a little bit of terminology. If I pay more pesos per dollar, then the dollar is getting more expensive in terms of the pesos. And this is called an appreciation of the dollar and a depreciation of the peso, because the peso is getting cheaper in terms of dollars, so the pesos will depreciate relative to the dollar. And the dollar will appreciate. So how does that work? So remember that if I pay more pesos per dollar, then that is a depreciation of the peso and an appreciation of the dollar. That basically means more people want to switch pesos to dollars. So they want to, the demand for dollars is going up relative to the demand. To the degree to which people want to exchange pesos to dollars is going to go up relative to the degree to which people want to exchange dollars to pesos. And you're seeing that that's exactly like an upward shift in the demand curve in this diagram. Now, there's some normative terminology on exchange rates. So a lot of people can call an appreciation of the dollar, where the dollar is basically expensive in terms of other, becoming more expensive, or is already very expensive in terms of other currencies, as a strong dollar. And that's a very, very normative statement. So there are people who advocate a strong dollar policy. I hope when you go through this part on exchange rates, and that's kind of the most important takeaway, besides the way how we account for it and how we think about markets for exchange rates, that it's nice to call it a strong dollar, but if the dollar is expensive and has appreciated, so think about this case, that's good for people. A strong dollar is good for people who buy stuff from abroad, because foreign goods are relatively less expensive, because you can exchange your dollar for a lot of foreign currency for which you can then buy foreign goods. But if people buy your stuff, then a strong dollar is not so good, because it makes your stuff more expensive. So a strong dollar is not necessarily a good thing. It's a good thing for some people and not for others. And the lecture on exchange rates in 714 goes through this in great detail. And I hope that that's something you take away from this part. That even though people talk about a strong dollar, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a good thing for everyone. Well, that's it. I am about to wrap up for this final office hour. Don't get too emotional. I wish you all the best on the final. I hope you're gonna nail it, I would say. We know this is not the easiest course to take on edX. It has a lot of material in it, but what I do think is that once you complete the final and you've gone through this whole course, you have covered a remarkable amount of material in 7 weeks, and really taken a full-fledged macroeconomic principles course that's given you a real good sense of what macroeconomics is about, what the main intuition is behind the main arguments in macroeconomics. You've experimented with that intuition, you've looked at the data. So even if you don't take any other courses in economics, I think this is really giving you a good foundation to think in economic terms. And if you take subsequent courses in economics, you'll see that this is a very good basis to build on. And remember, this course is always there for you to revisit in the archive section of your courses on edX, and kind of think of if there's things you learn and you're like, hey, that was in the principles course, how did that work there again? So do that. It's like a book on a shelf, but then on your computer. We're looking forward to seeing your results on the final, and to your feedback on the course. If there's anything you'd like to see improved, we are always working to make it better for you and for whoever else is taking this course in the future. So your feedback is very much appreciated. Okay, good luck, and it was a pleasure to teach you, and I hope you take this knowledge and use it to your advantage. Bye.